I'm Chance Dorland, and this is The Docket, our weekly interview program covering law and crime in San Antonio from expressnews.com, brought to you today by the law offices of Pat Maloney. And as always, joined now by San Antonio Express News course reporter Elizabeth Zavala. Great to have you back on the show, Liz. I think we're going to be discussing two cases today. And let's start with the capital murder case of Brian Flores. Apparently, both sides are starting over.
Yes, it's good to be back, Chance. We talked about this case a while back because this capital murder, multiple persons case involving Brian Flores was going to be the first death penalty case that Bexar County was going to be seeing since the capital murder trial of Mark Gonzalez, who in 2011 brutally killed Bexar County's Sheriff's Sergeant Kenneth Van when he was sitting at a stoplight. So what happened with the Brian Flores case was late last week, a judge declared a mistrial, and the reason was kind of interesting. The lawyer in the case, who's representing Brian Flores, had a really horrible accident. He fell down and he hit his head, and he has been not able to help with jury selection, which began in this case a couple of weeks ago. When we first talked about this case, Chance, we talked about how when jurors are being asked to send someone to death, it's a very long process. It can take up to about a month, at least 3 weeks, maybe sometimes 4, maybe a little bit longer, because the county has to call at least 1,000 people so that they can ask them questions. In fact, they give them questionnaires that are very large, and they ask them all kinds of questions that will help them figure out whether, where the person stands, whether or not they can actually send someone to death, and that sort of thing. So just to catch you up with the Brian Flores case, he was 33 years old and actually was already in jail on 2 other charges when he was arrested and charged with capital murder, multiple persons, in the deaths of 2 teenagers. They were Joshua Rodriguez, who was 18, and Victoria Dennis, who was 17. And these homicides occurred at the Churchill Park complex. It's an apartment complex in the 1200 block of Patricia Drive. I believe this is on the north side of San Antonio, on September 29th, 2015. And the specifics about this particular death were that the teenagers were allegedly killed over a sex tape that involved Rodriguez and a female who was not identified in the arrest warrant affidavit that was released to media at the time of these killings. And reports indicated that Rodriguez was threatened over social media, and it was involving a photograph of him and another woman, and not a sex tape. And that woman told authorities at the time that her boyfriend might have asked Flores to intervene in that, what appears just on the outset to be maybe like a love triangle type thing. So late last week, prosecutors Jason Goss and Gretchen Flater had begun this jury selection weeks ago with Flores' attorneys, Ed Camara and David Woodward. Last week, they appeared before Judge Susan Reed, who incidentally is the former Bexar County criminal district attorney. She served Bexar County for, I believe, 16 years before Nico LaHood won his race against her and has served 1 term. So when Jason Goss, Gretchen Flater, and David Woodard appeared last week before Judge Reed, Ed Camera was not there, and he is the attorney who fell and hit his head on June 18th, and that's what delayed proceedings. And this was kind of interesting because this was a hearing in which the attorney's doctor actually was subpoenaed to testify in this case. And the prosecutor, Jason Goss, was asking this doctor basically what we should expect with Mr. Camara's concussion. Mr. Camara is 77 years old, and his doctor testified that he has post-concussion syndrome and that he can't walk a straight line, and seems to be a little slower and kind of muted in his responses. So this kind of was kind of like I guess a learning experience, if you will, because really prosecutors wanted to see just exactly whether or not Mr. Camara could continue on the case. And the reason that that's important, I mean, there are a lot of trials that occur, murder trials, other sorts of felony cases where you have, the defense might have one attorney. They could have another attorney who might sit with them as kind of like a guidance, some sort of thing. But in death penalty cases and capital murder cases, you have to have two attorneys. So this is very, this was a very important hearing to just, to figure out how, whether or not they were going to be able to continue to seat this jury. So Mr. Camara's doctor, Burton Shaw, was answering several questions, not just from Jason Goss and from David Woodard, but also from Judge Reed herself, who is presiding over this case. And questions that they were asking was, whether or not he has, because of the concussion that he suffered, whether or not he's able to really sit through the grueling selection of jury, if you will, because, usually on a regular case, it'll take probably about a day to seat a jury for a murder case. But with this capital murder, especially seeking death, you're going to see more of a situation where, there's going to be possibly 5 people a day among the panel of 1,000 potential jurists who are going to come in, and they're going to answer that big, long questionnaire that attorneys are going to give them and ask them a ton of questions. So, all of these things were being asked of the doctor, questioning Mr. Camara's health and whether he could continue seating the jury. So one of the things that Dr. Shaw had said was he felt that they would have difficulty making the case that he was, completely able to do this, because he's not 100%. And in the questions that were the main questions that were asked were, how long is it going to take for him to be able to get to a point to where they could do this? And each time, basically the best that Dr. Shaw could say is that sometimes recovery for concussions, the recovery time can be a matter of weeks, sometimes a month, or he said some people 3 months, others it can take up to 6 months. So after listening to attorneys on both sides and then, the witnesses, the doctor did say that he felt that Mr. Camara could do office work, sit at a desk, and he agreed with Jason Goss that he likely could continue to pick a jury, but Woodard actually contended that the doctor really had no idea, what goes into jury selection. And as I had said, earlier, it takes a little bit of time. Now, one of the things that Jason Goss did assert to the judge and the rest of the people in the hearing was that he he felt that this could possibly be an attempt to drag out the case with continuances, basically because there is going to be a new district attorney administration that's going to be taking over in Bexar County January 1st of 2018. And that's because Tilden Schaefer is the Republican candidate for Bexar County Criminal District Attorney, and he is going to be facing Joe Gonzalez, who is the Democratic nominee. And one of them will be DA for Bexar County. So, and this has actually been going on at the courthouse a little bit. There's been some whispering as to whether or not some cases that have been delayed or, some, in this particular case, a mistrial that, some people are whispering that, there's a want and a desire to want to have some of this heard in a different administration, but, nobody's going to really say that on the record. So what ended up happening with this is that Judge Reed felt that it was so early in the process. She said that, if we wanted to call it a mistrial, that's what we would call it. And she removed Mr. Ed Kamara from the defense, and she had said that another attorney would be appointed to assist Mr. Woodard with Brian Flores' case. And, so this is likely to come back again once the dust settles on that. Judge Reed said that she would meet with all parties again for another hearing in this case, but a date has not been mentioned yet. So we will probably be talking about this again, Chance.
You're listening to The Docket, a new weekly interview program covering law and crime in San Antonio from expressnews.com, brought to you by our sponsor, the law offices of Pat Maloney. Speaking of something that we might discuss again in the future, here's an example of that for today's podcast. We are back with a familiar name, former Bexar County Public Defender Mark Benavides is back. He has another trial that is set for, correct me if I'm wrong, the 1st of October.
Yes, Mark Benavides was in court late last week, and we did talk about this in the spring when he was in Wilson County, where a jury in April convicted Mark Henry Benavides of continuous trafficking of persons. Now, this was a case where Mark Benavides, who was a defense attorney, he mostly defended and represented prostitution cases on the misdemeanor side, some drug cases, and he'd been an attorney for quite some time. But what ended up happening was that there were several of his former clients who came forward with outcries and accused Benavides of coercing them and threatening them and forcing them into having sex with him so that he would keep them out of jail or represent them. And he also videotaped the encounters. And during trial, we found out that there were hundreds of videotapes of encounters that he had had with numerous women, and several of these encounters on these tapes, or on these discs rather, were, cataloged. They had what scenes could be seen on them. It was a very, very intense trial. In fact, the first day that people that the state began presenting their case, and the moment that the jury saw the first video of a sexual encounter between Benavides and one of his accusers. And those videos were shown only to the jury and to the judge and to the people who were inside the area where the judge is. No one in the gallery was allowed to see it, but you could hear what was going on. It was very graphic, and in fact, it was so graphic that one of the jurors actually passed out after one of the videos was shown. The judge noticed that they needed to have a break, and as they were exiting the courtroom, one of the jurors actually just passed right out. So that trial lasted about 2 weeks, and that jury found him guilty and sentenced him to 80 years in prison for continuous trafficking of persons. So we were in a hearing late last week with Judge Dick Alcala, who is the visiting judge who is assigned to this case. And Mark Benavides has another attorney. A couple of weeks ago, his attorney during the trial, Monica Guerrero, was going to continue on, but in an appointed capacity. But now she is now off of the case, and there is a new attorney by the name of David Singleton, who actually is from Decatur, which is in North Texas. Singleton asked Judge Alcala if he could have a few more weeks to get up to speed on the case. So Judge Alcala has set a July 20th hearing to rule on a request for a change of venue. Now, the main reason we went to Wilson County from Bexar County in this case that was just tried a couple of months ago was because among the allegations of Benavides having sex with his clients were that he was actually, like many of these encounters were actually, they went on in the Bexar County Justice Center, particularly in the Cadena Reeves Justice Center, in some of the courtroom meeting rooms where Mark Benavides and his clients were actually appearing before judges. So that's one of the main reasons that the change of venue was granted in the first place, because attorneys did not want potential jurors doing their own investigations because they were in those very rooms where it was alleged that Mark Benavides was having sexual relations with his clients. So we're going to see once again whether or not we're going to be going somewhere else to hear the remaining cases. Now, there are 4 remaining cases against Mark Benavides. He has a sexual assault charge and 2 sexual assault of a child charges, along with the continuous trafficking of persons charge that is the newest case. And that is the one that the state would like to go to trial with. So what we have now with Mark Benavides is we'll be coming back on July 20th to figure out where the next trial is going to be heard, whether it's going to be in Bexar County, Wilson County, or any of the other adjoining counties. And then we anticipate that we'll be going to trial on October 1st, and that is the tentative date that Judge Alcala has set for the next hearing, or for the next trial, rather, for Mark Benavides.
So yes, Elizabeth, 2 cases that we'll probably be hearing more about here on the docket, but at least not for another week, because you're going to be taking some much deserved and probably much needed vacation time. So we're going to not have an episode next week. We'll take a week off, and then we'll be back 2 weeks later with more updates from Elizabeth Zavala.
Thanks so much, Chance. It'll be nice to take a little bit of a break, but I'm sure that there's going to be a lot to talk about once I get back.
And a big thank you to San Antonio Express News court reporter Elizabeth Zavala for joining me for today's episode of The Docket, our weekly interview program covering law and crime in San Antonio from expressnews.com, brought to you today by the law offices of Pat Maloney. And as I just mentioned, we'll be taking a week off. So see you back here on The Docket 2 weeks from now. For the San Antonio Express News, I'm Chance Dorland.